Welcome everyone to another episode from Off the Arrow Shelf, and today I'm going to be trying to cover gap shooting. Really great graphics this, isn't it? And this is from the point of view of an instinctive archer. So I'm Rob Jones, this is Off the Arrow Shelf, and I'm going to dive straight in. I want to do a big shout out though, and this is a huge thanks. And this is for support I've been shown from a Facebook group and also from the guys that have been posting on my Facebook pages and on my website about gap shooting and offering some advice, some guidance, especially the push family. A few of these are aware of it. The push listeners group is on Facebook. It's a brilliant group of individuals. Some offer some great thoughts and great advice. Sorry if you need me rustling, there's all my notes in the corner here. But I'm going to be talking about gap shooting, and they've offered some really nice insights, really good thoughts on it, and so have the other people have been feeding back to me in either emails or via the website. So what is gap shooting? Put simply, it is a method of consciously judging a distance to a target and then applying what's called a gap to that distance. And the idea being, when he says, as he reaches to try and grab an arrow from one of his bins, yep. So you got your arrow here, and I've put, excuse the really poor graphics, but I try to get my printer to work earlier. The idea is pretty simple. Smacking into all of my arrows right now. This is your archery target, and you want to put the point of your arrow either below, above it, or on it, and it is denoted by the distance that you are from the target. So you consciously, go to the distance to the target, let's say 20 meters, 20 yards, whatever you work in. And then what you will have done is you have worked out where the tip of your arrow needs to be in relation to where you actually want to hit. So if you want your arrow to hit here and you're at, let's say, 20 yards, and you know your gap is 6 inches below, then you actually put that 6 inches, tip of the arrow 6 inches below, and your arrow would fly, all other things being equal, to the target. And that's the basic kind of principle. It's knowing the distance that you are shooting and then applying an aiming method to it based on your bow characteristics and the tip of your arrow. Sounds really simple. This is, I'm talking as an instinctive archer, I'm talking as a coach, and I really struggle to do this. I struggle to be able to, I can explain it quite well when I'm actually coaching, but when it comes to actually shooting, I tend to find that I can't split my vision from the point of the arrow to the target that I'm actually aiming for. And what happens, and I think I posted something up on Instagram recently, what ends up happening is that as I try and focus on here, my bow arm tends to move and I tend to move, and then when I focus back on the target, I lose where the tip is, and I don't have this ability to have this split vision. That's a shortfalling of mine. I dare say if I probably did a lot more practice, I could probably get myself to be able to shoot non-instinctively and using gap. But there are a few things that you need to consider when you're doing this, and some of the kind of basics. Now, you know that I always talk about the archer's triangle, and those of you who haven't come across it, it's a very simple concept. It's a triangle of three things that affect you as an archer. One side is the archer, the other is the bow, and the last side is the arrow. Each of these three sides play a part. Now, with gap shooting, there's a few things you need to consider. And it all revolves around consistency. If you're shooting, you want to make sure that your arrows are all the same length. And the reason for that is you're going to be using the tip of your arrow as the marker. So if your arrow is longer or shorter, and I've got some broken arrows alongside with me, then your gap will change because the length of the arrow affects it. So you're looking at having a consistent arrow length, the spine of the arrow, the weight match of the arrow, because you might have an arrow that is the same length as other arrows. I'm just wondering if I've got a. This one's 455 grains. Most of my arrows are actually pretty well spined and weight matched around about the same. So I've got another one here, another one there, 466. Oh, sorry, 466 grains. I always mark it on a grain scale. I showed in a previous. There you go. Use a little grain scale to record everything. I'll zoom out a bit in a second. There you go. So I've got my grain scale here, and what I do is I record all my arrow weights on the arrow, and I have a record of where they're built and the length they are. So you need the arrow to be the same length, because if the arrow is a different length, then that's going to affect your gap. You need to be the same weight. So that's the arrow side of it. You need to be using the same bow, the same limb setup for it. So if you I have limbs and you're changing your limb weights all the time, your draw weight of your bow, that will affect it. And obviously there's the archer side, because you've got to be consistent. You've got to be consistent in your anchor. You've got to be consistent in your release, because if you don't have these consistencies, if sometimes you overdraw, and that's going to affect the flight of the arrow and your gap. So think about that. Think about the consistency. You've also got to be consistent in distance judgment. Now, this is something that I find interesting, because as an instinctive archer, I don't consciously gap. I don't look at the distance and go, oh, that's 45 yards. I know I need to aim 12 inches above point of impact. What I tend to do is I look at the target and go, yeah, I've shot that distance before. I feel like I need to be here. That's a very perishable skill, for an instinctive archer. You've got to shoot a lot of arrows to get comfortable in knowing exactly what's going on. And likewise, you need to have the same arrows, same spine, same fletching, same bow. It's fun, but it's tough. Gap shooting offers you a method by which you can have a technique that you can fall back on. And that's one of the big benefits with it. If you have got, let's say, a recurve bow, and then following day you might be shooting a flat bow. If you've got a list of all your gaps, and what people will do is they will make a list of all their gaps. So they might turn around and say, well, okay, if I'm shooting at 10 yards, I always put a strike through on the 0. If I'm shooting 10 yards, my gap's got to be, let's say, 10 inches below. If I'm shooting at 15 yards, then I'm going to be a little bit further away, so my gap might be only 8 inches. 20 yards is going to be going down to, say, 6 inches, and they'll have a little note here. And the very, very good archers, the ones that have spent a lot of time on this, won't just doing 5-yard increments. They'll have 10, they'll have 11 yards, 12 yards, 13 yards, and they'll all be marked out, and it'll be stored on a piece of paper or on their phone. And that is when you start getting really good. Where an instinctive archer is concerned is all of these sort of calculations are done in your head, and you need to be practicing a lot more. Anyway, so let's think about this. You've got a target on a boss. How do you work out what your gap is? How do you start the whole process off? There's a couple of ways of doing it. You could put the target up and just put the tip of your arrow. I'll grab another one of my arrows. To tip the arrow, and you put the tip of the arrow on the point, and then you'll do this multiple times. Don't just do this once. You need to shoot multiple times. And then you'll measure where the point of impact is. So if you're starting at 20 yards, let's say, you put a point of your arrow on the gold, the red, whatever it is, and your arrow will land above or below, and you'll do that consistency, and you'll end up with multiple arrow points or impact points. Once you've got that, you'll know that distance. You'll know that at 20 yards you might, let's say, be here. Might be there. Here's a bit of thing. What you'll then do is you might move forward to 15 yards and try, and you'll probably find that 15 yards you'll be aiming even lower, or need to be aiming lower, because if you'll be putting, sorry, I kind of got that the wrong way around, haven't I? Let me just, if you put the point of your arrow here, and at 20 yards you start impacting high, yeah, so that then you know that that's your gap from here to there is your gap at 20 yards. You then move a little bit further back and you find that your arrows are maybe impacting in the red. Let's say you shoot at 30 yards and you impact in the red, then you know that your point on distance is that. If you move closer, then chances are your arrows will, when you release them after putting your point of your arrow in the red, your arrow will impact higher, then you'll know that your point of aim will be needing to be lower. So effectively what you do is you kind of swap it around. And I've tried to kind of explain this. I've not done a great job. So what I've done is actually printed this off to try and show people. So at short distances, you've got your arrow tip here. Say you're shooting at 10 yards, you might actually be aiming, I put 18 inches below the target, because if you were to put your arrow tip, your arrow point on the red, your arrow would actually land 18 inches above the target. And let me just repeat that. If you at 10 yards were to put your arrow tip on the red in all the point of impact, desired point of impact, then the actual impact point location will probably be 18 inches above. And that would mean that your gap is 18 inches using that bow. This would change if you were using different arrows or different bow weight. Different combinations will result in different gaps. So moving back, what will happen is that your gaps will start to reduce down. So 10 yards, 20 yards, it might be 12 inches below. So as I said, negative 18, negative 12, negative 6 inches. And this is all based off what you would imagine almost like a ruler on the target. And I use this with students. I have a bamboo pole and a sheet of wood, a piece of card on the bottom, and I have it marked up in 6-inch increments. I'll put it alongside the target that they're actually wanting to hit, so that they can get used to seeing what like 6 inches are or 3 inches are, depending on what they want to work in. I tend to use 6 inches because I use a grey and black gaffer tape or duct tape, so that what you do is you have this hole down the side like this. Excuse my really poor drawing. And then it's marked off in 6-inch increments. And that might be in black, that one will be in black, that one will be in black, and then the other one will be in silver or white tape. Yeah. And then they'll be able to have a judgment when they're shooting on the range. Works quite well. I'll try and get some photographs and I'll show you the sort of stuff I've done in the past. But gap shooting is basically then thinking about what your gap is. Now, I've used the principle that you aim 18 inches, negative 18 inches below if you're very close in. Some people will actually just gap off the distance from the arrow tip to the target. So they might say, rather than 18 inches, well, if I'm putting my point here, that's might look like 18 inches below the target, but I can see that is only an inch as far as the tip to the point is concerned. I don't find that as easy to explain, but That's how some people do it. So your gaps you work on, and then at a longer distance, you're in the situation whereby at 40 yards, that might be your point on distance. 50 yards, you're actually aiming plus. So that actually should be an equal sign. So at 40 yards, you're on your point on. At 50 yards, you might be having to be above the point of impact. 60 yards, 12 inches, 18 inches when you're at 70 yards. Excuse me, also just get a drink. So that's the basic principles. You're working out the distance to your target. And there's various ways you can use that. We can't use rangefinders. It's all down to you learning to judge distance in NFAS, National Field Archery Society. So we shoot unmarked distances. So you work out what that distance is, and then what you do is you think, well, I know my distance. I think that's, let's say, 45 yards. Well, I know my point on is 40. I know at 50 yards I've got to be 6 inches above. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to aim for 3 inches above the target. And that's another interesting thing. Some people will look at the point of impact and they'll go, right, I'll need to be 6 inches above. And then that's how they work it. Others will actually look at the target and go, okay, I need to be 6 inches above. And then they move their point of aim to being 6 inches above rather than just thinking, I need to aim 6 inches above. I mean, not described as well as I would like, but it gives you basically an idea. How you go about working out your point on distances, how you work your gaps, well, that's kind of dependent on you. What I tend to recommend is I'll set somebody at 10 yards, and I've got huge bosses. I've got 4.5 foot square bosses on the range when I'm doing this with students. And what I'll do is I'll grab them and I'll say, okay, there's your target boss. Yeah, there's the target you're aiming for. You're at 10 yards. Now, if you put your point of your arrow on there, where does the arrow impact? And chances are it'll probably impact somewhere up here. If you then move back to 15 yards, then chances are your point of impact is there. What some people will do is, rather than having the target at the center of the boss, is they'll have the target set up and they'll actually put it at the bottom of the boss. And what they'll do, they'll start at 5 yards, they'll say at 5 yards, put the point of your arrow here, and let's see where your impact, and chances are you'll impact up here. And then they'll go to 10 yards, and gradually the impact will come lower down, until they are actually putting the point of the arrow on there, and that's where they're actually hitting. That's a good idea if you've got a small target boss, because you don't want your arrows going over the top, possibly due to you having a poor release or misjudgment on the distance. I've got large target bosses, so I know I can do that, and I've got a significant overshoot and an earth bank behind, so I know it's safe to do that. Okay, and there's loads I could say on this, and I'm sure I'm missing stuff out. The key thing with this, and I'll go back to what I said about the arrow, the arrow, the bow, and the archer, is that you've got to have a level of consistency. So explaining gap shooting to a complete beginner, you can do that, but it won't necessarily help, because they won't have a consistent draw, they won't have a consistent anchor, they might be changing limbs in a few weeks' time. So it's good for you to get the basics of shooting first, have a solid form, to then start thinking about getting your gap distances in, and doing something on the range like we do here when I'm teaching it. It works quite well, because it then gives the people a scaffolding on something, to a structure on which to build their shooting and build their judgments and distances and where their arrow lands. Now, it works really well. As I said, it's something that the big advantage with gaps is that you can have a record like shown here on your other sheets of paper. You can have a record of what your gaps are for your bow. So that could be for your Olympic recurve or your hunting bow if you're in the States and you're hunting. It could be your flat bow. But then if you like to then swap to a different bow, you might have a different set of gaps for that bow. And it means you can pick up the bow and get accurate with it pretty quickly and get back into being accurate. Whilst instinctively you can't do that because you're trying to build subconscious sight maps or shooting map in your head as to what you need to do. The key thing though is take your time. Don't think you can go and like here I just put 3 crosses in. You've got to shoot several arrows to get that consistency. You've got to do that because that's what you're after is consistency. You want to be able to shoot 20, 30, 40 arrows and do it over several days. And then basically go, right, okay, I know that's my gap for 50 yards. I know my gap is at 10 yards, etc. Without that repeated or success and repeated points of impact, if you've got, for example, 1 arrow hits here, 1 arrow hits there, 1 arrow hits there, then yes, your gap is probably going to be up here, but you need to repeat this. You need to get that process. And that's something that is really useful to remember. So I'm just grabbing my notes and just going back through them. The thing that I find hardest is that consistency on that kind of split vision, which I've spoken about before. But anyway, that was the basics. I don't know how well this has been described. I hope I have done a good job at it. I hope I have made sense. But in essence, what you're trying to work out when you're gap shooting is how far to offset your point of aim to have the arrow impact where you want it to land. So just going back to this one. At longer distances, you're going to be adding height effectively to where your point of aim is. And at a lower distance, you're going to be reducing because you're going to be aiming into the target. Anyway, thanks very much. Drop me a line if you want to discuss this. Thanks for the feedback to those people who've been asking me and saying that they really like the video format. I'm going to try and do another one on points, the different types of field points you can come across in field archery, whether you're using bows or whether you're using brass points. There's some more brass points to see different types of brass points you can use. But anyway, in the meantime, take care. Sorry, I'm crushing and banging because I've put arrows back. Take care and enjoy your shooting. Oh, and before I forget, drop me a line offthearrowshelf.com. You find me on Instagram, I still got it, Twitter, all the other kind of media stuff out there.